one of the big stories of the week has been this commitment, or this comment, should I say, from Stephen Jones. Have a look at this.
There's plenty of evidence that the stuff that's already in the system, the interest rate rises that are already in the system, are pulling money out of the economy and dampening down on demand. And we are concerned that further increases are going to put pressure on households and businesses.
To some, this looks like a government minister repeatedly putting pressure on an independent body to make the government look good and deflect blame from that same government's failure to curb spiralling inflation. To others, Jones is just saying what's on the minds of millions of Australians. Simon Birmingham, the Coalition's finance spokesman, called for Stephen Jones's resignation this week because his repeated comments undermine the independence of the Reserve Bank. But so far, Jones hasn't budged and Mr Albanese hasn't fired him. There's a pretty good reason for that. Jones is simply covering for the underperformance of Albanese and Treasurer Jim Chalmers. Pre-election, Labor told you they understood the cost of living and that they had a plan to fix it. They told you wages were too low and that costs were too high and that they knew how to make it right. But now we know their cupboard is bare. Their energy and environmental policies keep pushing up the price of energy and also the price of transport. And these flow on to make everything right through to your supermarket shelves a dearer price. Radical reunionisation moves have made it more expensive to do business, more disruptive, but without making much difference to your pay packet. Labor's promises not to reduce spending mean the inflationary pressure of government excess remains. The RBA has just one lever available to push back on inflation, but without the government doing its bit, every mortgage holder ends up carrying the can for Labor's inertia. And sadly, that means you. Joining me now is independent economist Warren Hogan. Warren, welcome to the program. Let's get your take on that Stephen Jones video. Is Jones right to say what he said?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda, for having me on the show. I really would not agree with the Assistant Treasurer talking in that manner. I think that the government should steer clear, and when they don't steer clear of the RBA, they should be supportive and explaining why what the RBA is doing is so important and in our long-term best interests. So I do not agree that necessarily that this is a heinous crime against independence, but it was clearly a misstep. It's clearly part of this process of the government trying to disassociate itself politically from the rate hikes. But more importantly, it really just looks like it's putting pressure on the RBA to go easy when they already are. They're lagging the rest of the world. Their rates are much lower than US, Canada, New Zealand. So there's evidence to say that, we've got the most dovish central bank, the most cautious central bank when it comes to raising rates, and that looks like the government's putting pressure on them to do that.
How much blame can the Reserve Bank realistically be taking for where we are right now?
The problem the Reserve Bank has is their bad guidance in the pandemic about the 2024, which is all very well understood. And you could argue that they overdid it a little bit, but that happened actually all around the world, so we probably can't hold them to that. But in terms of the rate rises we're seeing now, the governor and the leadership of the Reserve Bank and the Reserve Bank Board is doing everything it reasonably can to get this economy onto a sustainable footing, to get inflation under control without creating any excessive hardship. And the problem with that is that they're risking getting behind the game, a risk that other central banks around the world will not take. And of course, exposing Australia to the economy getting away from us and inflation getting away from us. And as the governor finally came out and said on Friday in his parliamentary commitment, he said that that is going to result in much higher unemployment, much higher interest rates, and potentially a damaging recession. So, I think the RBA is actually, if you're going to criticise them for doing anything, it's that they're not doing enough. They're leaving us exposed to this risk of a much bigger inflation problem.
You mentioned just then RBA Governor Philip Lowe's performance before estimates in the Parliament this week. What did you make of his performance as he was pretty relentlessly grilled about interest rates?
Well, I thought he performed in line with the great traditions of central banking. That's not to, say too much. Certainly, he was very careful around anything politically sensitive, which of course meant that he couldn't comment on things like fiscal policy. I mean, he said that it's okay and it's broadly neutral, as the Treasury Secretary on Wednesday said as well. But I think he did quite well, especially on Friday when he started to push back a bit more. The reality is, and I think this is the most important thing that he said, is that they have got Australia's long-term interests at heart, and that is how their behaviour is dictated, and they are doing the best that they can. So I actually thought that he came across and communicated some of the key messages well, and I hope it's a pathway to him getting reappointed, because I know it's not popular at the moment, but I think he's the best person to do the job in what is probably going to be the most tricky 2 or 3 years ahead for monetary policy we've seen in generations.
Yeah, it's really difficult with so many Australians feeling the pain of inflation, and it's a bit of a low move to be, as a government, trying to blame the RBA for the failure to do what a government should be doing. Thank you so much for your time, Warren Hogan. Really appreciate your time on the show.